The scent of lilies still hung in the air, sweet, mournful, and cold, like the echo of a farewell that refused to fade. I sat in the old wooden chair by the window, the one Elaine used to claim on quiet afternoons, and stared out at Mirror Lake. A thin veil of mist floated over the water, turning everything beyond the porch into a soft blur of gray and silver. This house had always been her favorite place. She used to plant lavender along the porch steps, so that the wind, when it passed through, would carry the fragrance into every room. Now the scent of lavender was gone. Only the lilies remained, funeral lilies, thick and suffocating, and the sound of the clock ticking on the wall, giving each second a name before letting it go. On the coffee table, our wedding photograph stood among the condolence cards that no one had the heart to put away. I touched the glass frame. My finger trembled. Elaine was smiling in the picture, her eyes bright and young, caught forever in that summer sunlight 40 years ago. Behind me, the door creaked. Ryan stepped inside. His black suit was wrinkled from the long day, his tie a little off-center. But what drew my eyes wasn't his clothes. It was the light in his face, something taut and sharp. Something I hadn't seen before. Determination, maybe. Or hunger. He sat down across from me, placing a paper cup of coffee on the table, and leaned forward as though he couldn't wait to begin. "Dad let me handle everything," he said, his tone smooth, controlled. "Mom left a memorial fund, a few accounts, property documents. I'll take care of all of it. It'll be clean, efficient." For a moment, I didn't answer. I just looked at him. That morning, he'd stood behind a lectern, hands trembling, reading a eulogy about compassion and gratitude, about how his mother taught him the meaning of decency. His voice had broken when he said her name. Now, not even 6 hours later, he was talking about paperwork and transfers, his voice steady, businesslike. I listened, and I didn't recognize him. "You sure you know what you're doing?" I asked. My voice sounded quieter than I meant it to. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that moved only half his face. "You don't need to worry. I just need your signature on a few forms so the bank can confirm contact and keep the taxes clean. I'll help you wrap everything up for Mom's fund. Quick and simple." Outside, the light was dying over the lake. The sunset spread across the water in a slow wave of lavender and copper. I wanted to tell him I could handle things myself. I wanted to remind him that for 40 years, Elaine had trusted me to take care of this house, this family, everything. But then I saw the certainty in his eyes, young, confident, unyielding, and something in me hesitated. "Do what you need to do," I said finally. "You know best." He nodded once, already opening his briefcase. The papers inside were fresh, still smelling of ink and toner. I signed where he pointed. Line after line, signature after signature, each one neat, deliberate, and detached. I watched my own handwriting become a stranger to me. When he finished gathering the pages, he closed the case gently, with a faint, satisfied click. It was the sound a man makes when business is done. As he stood to leave, I said, "You know, your mother always believed in keeping things simple." He paused at the doorway, turned halfway, and smiled again. Polite, effortless, practiced. "Dad," he said, "nothing simple anymore." The door closed behind him. The house went still again. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the ceiling beams filled the silence. I looked down at my hand. There was a smudge of ink along my thumb from the last form I'd signed. The mark looked small, but it felt heavier than it should have. In the reflection of the window, I saw myself. Gray hair, tired shoulders, the face of a man trying to outweight grief. For a second, I thought I saw Elaine sitting beside me, her head tilted the way it always did when she listened. I could almost hear her say it. "Don't worry, Ryan knows what he's doing." Maybe she would have believed that. Maybe I wanted to. But something inside me refused to settle. It was small, almost quiet, like a thread pulling loose from the edge of a sleeve, but I felt it. Night fell over the lake. I turned on the old kitchen radio, the one Elaine refused to replace. A woman's voice came through reading market numbers in a dry, emotionless tone. I thought of Ryan again, how he used to talk about finance like it was faith, how he said money should never sleep. I used to admire that certainty in him. I thought it meant ambition. 5 years ago, he bought me a restored pickup truck for my birthday. Said I could drive it to the lake like the old days. I remember how proud I was, how neighbors waved as he pulled up every Sunday. Back then, I thought I'd done something right, that I'd raised a good man. But now, sitting here in the quiet, those memories felt fragile, like they belonged to someone else's life. I poured myself a drink, took a slow sip, and said to the empty room, "Elaine, are you sure we taught him the right things?" Outside, the wind picked up, brushing through the pine branches. Leaves skittered across the porch. Somewhere down by the dock, the water lapped against the wood, steady as breath. I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. In the dark, I saw Ryan's face again, the faint gleam in his eyes when he smiled, the look of a man already thinking 5 steps ahead. Ambition, maybe, or something colder. When I told him to handle things, I thought I was giving him a chance to grow, to prove himself. What I didn't realize was that I was handing him something far rarer, something harder to take back. I was giving him my trust. Across the lake, a porch light flickered, once then went out, leaving the water swallowed in a perfect, unbroken dark. Rain hadn't stopped since the night before. Long, silvery strands slid down the windowpane, tapping softly against the wooden eaves like a slow, deliberate rhythm. A week had passed since Elaine's memorial, yet the house by Mirror Lake still carried the scent of lilies and candle wax, as if time itself had chosen to linger here. On the dining table, our wedding photo still stood between unfiled condolence cards, and on the porch, Elaine's lavender pots bowed their wet heads under the spring rain, their pale purple melting into the gray light of an Oregon morning. I had just poured a cup of tea when I heard a car pull up in the driveway. Headlights swept across the window, bright and fleeting, then disappeared. The door opened. Ryan stepped in, bringing with him the smell of rain and gasoline. His jacket was dark, his hair damp, a few drops clinging to his collar. He didn't say hello. He simply set a thick stack of documents on the table. "Dad, I just need your signature on a few small things," he said. His tone was light, but his pace was quick-clipped. I looked at the folder. Under the desk lamp, the title gleamed in bold type, "Trustee Contact Confirmation and Tax Withholding Election." I read it aloud slowly. Ryan nodded, smiled faintly. "Just confirmation forms," he said, "information updates for the memorial fund, and some tax elections routine stuff to keep things smooth later. Catherine's on leave in California," he added. "I'll file this now and get her signature when she's back." He spoke easily, like a man giving a presentation he'd already rehearsed. But something in the way he delivered those lines, too fluid, too practiced, made me uneasy. I sat down, opened the file. The paper was thick, the ink still sharp with that chemical tang of something freshly printed. I started to read. The text was dense with jargon and fine print words curling and folding into each other like the gears of a machine. For 30 years, I'd worked as an engineer reading blueprints precise to the millimeter. But this language, this financial language, felt different. Too smooth, too cold. Every line seemed built to make you stop asking questions. Rain whispered against the windows. The sound filled the room like static. I turned a page and saw a small italicized box at the bottom, faint enough that I had to tilt it toward the light. My finger brushed the line. "What's this part?" I asked. Ryan didn't hesitate. That's for the bank's contact record. It doesn't affect your authority, Dad. It's just an internal section. He slid the folder closer, already flipping to the signature page. I've got a meeting with the bank at 3, he said. If you sign now, they'll process it faster. The tax deadlines this year are a mess. You don't want to get dragged into that paperwork. Trust me. I looked up. His face was thinner than usual, the last few days of grief still visible around his eyes. Yet behind the exhaustion, something burned, eager, impatient. For a moment, I wanted to ask about the details to slow him down. But then I remembered what Elaine used to say in this very kitchen years ago, when Ryan was still in college. If you want your son to grow, let him try. Don't trap him inside an old man's caution. I held the pen for a long moment. It was an old Parker, the one Ryan had given me last Christmas. When the tip touched paper, I could hear my heartbeat in my chest. The ink spread slowly like water through sand. My hand trembled once, then steadied. Ryan placed a hand lightly on the back of my chair. I just want you to relax, Dad, he said softly. You don't need to deal with these things anymore. Mom would be proud. She'd want me to take care of it. He gathered the papers, neatly folded them into his briefcase, and stood. The movement was efficient, polished. I'll come back this weekend, he said. We'll go over the rest with the bank. I nodded, though I wasn't sure why. The door opened, and the draft stirred the curtains. The headlights flared once more across the porch, then faded down the slope toward the road, swallowed by fog. I stayed at the table. The tea had gone cold, the steam vanished. One loose page remained tucked beneath the others. I pulled it closer. At the bottom, in small gray print, it read, Authorization valid until account revision completed. The words blurred slightly. I read them again and again. My pulse picked up for reasons I couldn't name. It's just tax paperwork, I told myself. Nothing more. But the more I tried to reassure myself, the more hollow the words felt, as though I was trying to convince not my mind, but my conscience. That night I couldn't sleep. The rain went on steady, patient. Each drop felt like a reminder, soft but relentless. I got up before dawn, turned on the lamp, and opened the file again. My eyes stopped on my own signature. The ink had bled slightly, the lines uneven, spreading like diluted blood through water. I set the papers down, looked around the darkened room. The air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and cold tea, and I felt unmistakably that something in the room had shifted. As if by signing, I'd opened a door I couldn't yet see through. A gust of wind rattled the window, snuffing out the small porch light. The house fell into complete darkness. I sat there listening to the storm breathe around me, and thought of Ryan, of that look in his eyes, sharp and unreadable, and of Elaine, who used to say trust was the thing that held a family together. Her voice returned to me faint as an old melody on the radio. Don't sign anything you don't understand. I whispered into the dark Elaine. Tonight, I did the opposite. 3 months after that rain, summer settled over Bend, Oregon, bright, vast, and strangely silent. Every morning, sunlight came through the kitchen window and caught the edge of the old wedding photo, me and Elaine, 2 young people in white, smiling, as if the world could never turn against us. Neither of us knew that time would take almost everything except the memory. I was learning to live alone. Wake early, boil water, let the lake breeze drift through the open window. The sound of the water against the shore was softer than I remembered, like it too had grown cautious. I trimmed the grass, tended the lavender Elaine had planted. She used to say lavender kept a home calm, that peace had a scent if you cared to notice it. It still bloomed now, but there was no one left to share its color with. One afternoon in June, my neighbor Helen Brooks stopped by. She was a few years older, white hair in a neat bun, carrying a tray of lemon bars that filled the kitchen with sugar and sunlight. "Thomas," she said, setting it on the table. "I just saw a photo Ryan posted a new house in Seattle. Looks stunning. Private pool and everything. Business must be good, huh?" I froze mid-smile. A house in Seattle. Ryan had never mentioned moving. I couldn't think of a single reason he'd leave Bend. I forced a small laugh. "Yeah, the company's growing fast." Helen nodded, chatted about neighborhood repairs, the new grocery opening near the highway, but I barely heard her. The sentence replayed in my mind, steady mechanical like the tick of the clock behind me. That night, the air cooled. I opened Elaine's old laptop, meaning to find her chicken soup recipe, the one she made on rainy nights. The fan buzzed as it booted, screen flickering before settling into the familiar desktop. As I moved the cursor, a small pop-up appeared in the corner: monthly statement. First Pacific Bank. I almost closed it, assuming it was an auto email. But my eyes caught a line underneath Elaine Keaton Memorial Fund. Something tightened in my chest. I remembered the day she started that fund, with Catherine Doyle as advisor. Elaine said if the day ever came when she wasn't here, at least the fund would keep helping the students she loved. I couldn't ignore it. I clicked the message open. The statement appeared, rows of black text, clean and uniform. The first entry stopped me cold. Transfer to Keaton Financial Group, LLC. $42,800. I read it again out loud this time, as if the sound could make it make sense. Keaton Financial Group, Ryan's firm. I scrolled further. 3 more transfers. Different dates. Total over $160,000. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. I zoomed in on the confirmation section at the bottom. Authorized by Thomas Keaton. The signature was mine, same curve, same tilt, but it wasn't one I remembered writing. I leaned back. My pulse thudded in my ears. The kitchen suddenly felt cold, the kind of cold that creeps in when realization begins to form. I went to the drawer, pulled out the stack of documents Ryan had brought that rainy afternoon. Thick pages, dense ink. I flipped through them one by one. Near the bottom of a page, I saw it faint italic text along the margin. Effective authorization for account transaction and investment activities under trustee name. I read the sentence again, then once more. Slowly, the meaning sank in. That day, I hadn't just signed a tax form. I had given my son full authority to move, invest, and use the memorial fund that bore his mother's name. I sat perfectly still. Outside, frogs croaked near the lake and the wind sighed through the pines. I looked down at my hands, hands that once built things, drew lines straight as truth itself. They trembled now, foreign, useless. I opened a browser and typed Keaton Financial Group. The website loaded: Ryan in a white shirt, smiling in front of a glass building. Below, a line read, "A rising leader in Pacific Northwest Asset Management." I scrolled down to a section titled Project Funding Partners. The screen filled with company names and funds, and then I saw it among the black text in plain sight: Keaton Memorial Investment Trust. My vision blurred. I closed the laptop and leaned back, the chair creaking beneath me. The room tilted. I thought of Helen's voice, the house with the pool. I thought of Ryan's words, "Mom would be proud." I heard myself at the funeral. "I trust you, son." I didn't know whether to call him or stay silent until I knew more. I'd spent my life depending on precision, on facts, on proof. And yet here I was, a man who no longer understood his own child. I went back to the desk and turned on the printer. The hum filled the kitchen like static. Sheets began sliding out, one by one, still warm with ink. I stared at the numbers. 42,800, 39,600, 78,000. Each one cut a little deeper, carving out what faith remained. I steadied my breathing. In the distance, thunder rolled over the hills. A flash of lightning lit the surface of Mirror Lake, the reflection white and blinding for a heartbeat before it vanished. I looked down at the paper, trembling in my hands, the ink glistening under the light, and I knew something irreversible had begun. I folded the statement, placed it in the drawer, and locked it. The sound was small, but it echoed through the room like the final click of a closing door. I looked around the wedding photo, the reading chair, the wool blanket draped neatly over the armrest. Everything was where it had always been. Except me. I had already lost Elaine once, and now I could feel it happening again, this time the slow death of trust, the kind that leaves you awake long after the storm has passed. The morning came early. Sunlight slid through the blinds in thin, patient lines and fell across the lake outside my window. Mirror Lake was calm again, so calm it made last night feel like a dream I should have already forgotten. The water glittered under the Oregon sky, silver and forgiving, as if nothing had been taken from it. The breeze moved softly through the pines. The faint scent of lavender drifted in through the open door, the one Elaine always left ajar for the light to find its way in. Everything looked peaceful, too peaceful. And for a second, I thought if I hadn't opened that email, if I'd gone to bed early, maybe I'd still believe that everything was fine. I sat at my desk by the window. The paper from 3 months ago still had a faint blot of ink on the corner, my pen's hesitation frozen in time. I lined up the printed statements from last night, arranging them in order the way an engineer arranges blueprints, hoping logic could still explain something that had already crossed into betrayal. 4 transactions, 4 numbers. Each one cold, immaculate. Together they made a single truth, $160,000 transferred to Keaton Financial Group, LLC, my son's company. At the bottom of each page, the bold print waited like a dare. Authorized by Thomas Keaton. My name, my signature, perfectly familiar and utterly wrong. The slant, the rhythm, even the confident flick at the end. Only it was too confident, too steady. I knew my own hand, the tremor that came with age, the way the pen stuttered when I paused to think. Whoever made this hadn't needed to pause. They already knew what they were doing. A heaviness spread in my chest, slow and deliberate, like something sharp sinking in, but refusing to leave. By noon, I was driving down Highway 97 toward downtown Bend. The air shimmered above the asphalt. The town looked washed in sunlight, bright and indifferent. I parked outside the First Pacific Bank, a glass building too clean for what it held inside. Inside, the air smelled of toner and cologne, of paper, and the faint hum of air conditioning. The kind of smell that makes you feel like everything is under control even when it isn't. James Carter came out from his office, the same easy smile he'd worn years ago when I met him at Ryan's house, back when everything Ryan touched felt like promise. He was older now, like me, though he hid it better. "Tom," he said warmly. "Been a long time." "What brings you in?" I placed the file on the counter. "Just wanted to confirm a few things." He flipped through the papers. His eyes moved fast, trained, scanning for numbers that didn't belong. Then he stopped, and the air shifted. It wasn't hesitation, it was recognition, the kind that comes with boundaries. He closed the file slowly, aligned it perfectly with the counter, and looked at his tie instead of me. "James," I said, my voice steady, "you don't have to explain. Just answer one question. Is there anyone other than me who could have authorized these transfers?" His eyes lifted just for a moment. Something flickered, pity, guilt, fear, it didn't matter. Because in that look, I got my answer. There was. I nodded, closed the folder, and slipped it into my briefcase. He didn't move, just stood there with his hands clasped, shoulders tight, the way a man stands in the presence of something irreversible. I could feel his eyes on me until the glass doors shut behind me. Outside, the sun hit hard, white, sharp, and merciless. I started the truck, let the AC hum, and sat there, hands on the steering wheel that suddenly felt too large for me. The street was alive, cars, passing, laughter. Someone calling a name, but it all came through muffled, distant, like I was behind a wall of glass. The phone buzzed. A new message. "Don't worry about those transfers, Dad. I'm investing for the family's future." That was all. No apology, no hesitation, just certainty. I stared at the words until the screen dimmed. The confidence in his tone had the same chill as the signature on that paper. I didn't answer. The road back to Mirror Lake wound through miles of pine forest and dry grass fields. The heat bent the horizon into a wavering line. I drove slower than usual, my thoughts louder than the engine. The air coming through the cracked window carried the resinous sting of sun-warmed pine and dust. In the rearview mirror, I caught my reflection, the slumped shoulders, the hollow eyes of a man who'd seen too much and understood too late. I turned away. Halfway home, I pulled over. The truck idled. I turned off the engine and let the silence fill in where faith used to be. The phone lit up again, the same message glowing on the black screen, steady as a heartbeat. I remembered Ryan at 12 coming home with a math test marked A+. He said he wanted to be an engineer like me. Elaine had laughed, touched his hair. I told him he could be anything he wanted as long as he stayed decent. That word came back now, thin and empty. I stepped out. The air was thick with heat, the kind that presses down on your lungs. Far off Mirror Lake shimmered under the sunlight, a perfect mirror reflecting everything except what mattered. I looked at my hands. They were still trembling, as if my body understood what my mind refused to say aloud. There are times when silence isn't born of trust. It's born of fear. Fear that one more question might destroy what little truth you're still clinging to. I sat on the hood of the truck, the metal hot beneath my palms. The air tasted like iron and dust. Far in the west, clouds began to gather, dark, heavy, patient. The kind of clouds that don't just bring rain, they bring change. And when they come, they take something with them, something you can never get back. 2 days later, I drove south toward Eugene. The morning light stretched thin across the hills, slow and deliberate, as if the world itself was waking carefully not to disturb something fragile. The road wound along the ridge, the same road Elaine and I used to take on weekends, back when the truck smelled of coffee and rain, and she'd sing along to the old songs she claimed would never age. The pines were still there, taller now, their roots clutching the wet soil. The air smelled of moss and the faint sweetness of wood after a storm. Each curve brought a memory I hadn't asked for. The sky hung low, the kind of gray that feels heavy enough to fall. Both sides of the road were slick with puddles, the reflection of the clouds trembling like they were trying to hold still. My hands tightened around the wheel. The folder beside me sat motionless, thick with paper and weight bank statements, photocopies of the forms I had signed, and a certificate that no longer meant what it once did. Catherine Doyle's office stood at the corner of Willamette, a red brick building with ivy climbing the edges and a brass nameplate that caught the light like a promise. The same one Elaine and I had walked under the last time we were here, when she was still strong enough to climb the stairs without resting halfway. She trusted Catherine called her the only lawyer she knew, who still believed that law should protect, not consume. Standing before that same door now, I wondered how many promises had withered since Elaine's voice last filled this hallway. Catherine opened the door before I could knock. Her face hadn't changed much, silver hair pulled back neatly, eyes that still carried the sharpness of someone who saw through everything, yet chose gentleness over judgment. "Thomas," she said, her tone both surprised and certain. "You didn't come just to say hello." I didn't answer. I simply held out the folder. Her office smelled the way memory does, coffee gone cold, books too long on the shelf paper aging quietly in the corners. The afternoon light spilled across the wooden desk, where a small clock ticked steadily, the kind of ticking that reminds you the world doesn't stop no matter what you learn. I sat down and she began to read. The sound of paper turning filled the room, soft and measured. Each page felt heavier than the last. With every rustle, I could feel something inside me thinning, as if my faith was wearing down one layer at a time. When she reached the page marked First Pacific Bank, she stopped. Her finger rested on the line that read, Keaton Financial Group, LLC. She stayed there for a long moment, then looked up. Her eyes had that quiet gravity people wear when truth starts to form behind their silence. Elaine updated her living trust 3 months before she passed, she said. You were named sole trustee, the only one with authority to make financial decisions about the fund. Not your son, not anyone else. No transaction can happen without your authentic signature. I felt the chair harden beneath me. My fingers found the armrests and clenched until they burned. But I did sign, I said softly. After the funeral. Ryan brought over some papers, said it was temporary. Something about tax forms. I remember it clearly. Catherine leaned forward. Do you remember what you signed exactly? Her question hung in the air like a weight. I tried to pull the memory into focus. The rain that morning, the smell of wet wood, Ryan's voice steady, almost rehearsed. The papers spread on the table, my name already printed on some of them. It looked harmless, I said finally. Just confirmation paperwork. I didn't think to read every line. She exhaled long and heavy and looked at me in the kind of way people do when they've seen this before and wished they hadn't. Thomas, it's possible he slipped in a falsified page or attached new ones after you signed. That's how they do it, real pages masking the false. One signature can legitimize it all. The air in the room thinned. My chest tightened. I couldn't hear the clock anymore, only the rush of my own heartbeat, the sound of it stumbling over itself. For a moment, even Catherine's voice was distant. When it returned, it was steadier. If that's the case, she said, this isn't a family misunderstanding. This is forgery, and it's serious. I'll need to submit everything to the state's investigative office. I looked past her to the window. Outside, the poplars bent under a weak wind, scattering a slow rain of leaves. Elaine once told me, I said the words trembling, never let trust take the place of caution. I thought she meant the world. I didn't realize she was warning me about our own son. Catherine didn't speak for a while. Then she placed her hand gently over the folder. Her hand looked fragile, veins rising beneath the skin, but her grip was steady. Sunlight slipped through the window and flashed against her glasses, a line of brightness that didn't last long. Thomas, she said, truth isn't gentle. When it comes, it doesn't just light a room, it burns through everything you thought would last. I stared at the folder. The papers inside rustled faintly, though neither of us had moved. There are cracks that time creates slowly, years in the making. And then there are cracks that appear in an instant, born from trust itself, breaking quietly from the inside out. I stood, thanked her in a voice that didn't sound like mine, and walked toward the door. The hallway outside was bathed in amber light, the kind that looks warm but feels cold. Behind me, Catherine called out, "Thomas, let me help." I stopped but didn't turn. I only nodded once and kept walking. Outside, the air had cleared. Eugene spread out before me, the sky rinsed blue again. The hills in the distance wore the last light of day like a faded memory. The wind carried the smell of wild grass and exhaust, the blend of nature and man honest in its imperfection. At the bottom of the steps, I paused, staring at the sunlight spilling over the hood of my truck. It was too bright to look at directly. I opened the door, sat behind the wheel, and let my hands rest on the steering column, still and pale against the dark leather. For a moment, everything went silent, the street, the wind, even the clock inside my chest. And then I heard it, Elaine's voice, soft and certain, rising from somewhere between memory and prayer. "Don't let trust replace caution." I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, my reflection in the windshield stared back at me, blurred, uncertain, more shadow than man. And for the first time, I wondered if what I'd lost wasn't just money or even faith. Maybe it was the version of myself who believed that family was unbreakable. Friday night came wrapped in a fine Oregon rain, the kind that doesn't fall so much as linger, thin, slow threads of silver clinging to the glass, tracing long lines that never quite disappear. The house by Mirror Lake sat in the glow of a single lamp, a pool of weak yellow light against the dimness. I sat alone in the living room, listening to the quiet percussion of wind against the eaves and the faint smell of wet lavender drifting in through the cracks of the door. On the table, the stack of bank statements lay untouched, neatly aligned beside the framed wedding photo of Elaine. The phone rang. Ryan's name lit up the screen. I hesitated for a heartbeat before answering. His voice came through sharp, tight around the edges. "Dad, are you home? I'm coming by." I looked toward the window, the silhouette of the pines bending over the dark water outside. "I'm here," I said. "Some storms aren't meant to be stopped. You just let them break." 15 minutes later, headlights swept across the driveway, then went out. The door opened. Cold air slipped in with the smell of gasoline and rain. Ryan stepped inside his coat, soaked his hair dripping against his forehead, his phone still glowing in his hand. His face carried that look people wear when they come ready to defend, not to listen. "Dad." He started dropping his bag onto the couch. "The bank called. They said the memorial fund's been frozen." "What did you do?" I met his eyes steady. "I didn't do anything. I just asked why $160,000 of your mother's fund disappeared." He stopped, the line of his shoulders tightening. "Dad, this is business. The money's safe. I just moved it into a better portfolio, higher yield. You wouldn't understand." I watched him closely. The way his eyes flickered away from mine, the same way they had when he was 12 and lied about the missing bicycle. I remembered believing him then until a neighbor rolled the bike back into our yard and told me Ryan had sold it to buy a video game console. "Ryan," I said quietly, "do you know whose name is on that fund?" He frowned. "Elaine Keaton Memorial Fund." "Why no," I said slowly. "Elaine Keaton, and the forged signature of Thomas Keaton." The silence that followed had weight, the kind that fills a room, presses against your ribs. The clock ticked faintly on the wall, and rain tapped the roof like a question that wouldn't stop asking itself. Ryan looked at me, then turned toward the window, where the lake reflected the dim, trembling light. That's when I saw Melissa. She must have come in with him, sitting quietly on the armchair near the corner. Her hair was damp, her hands clasped tight in her lap. "He didn't mean any harm, Mr. Keaton," she said softly. "He's just trying to help." He wanted to make things easier for you. Ryan spun toward her, his voice rising. You think I stole from him, from my own father? I didn't raise my voice. I think you've forgotten who taught you the difference between helping and taking. The wind outside picked up the rain hardening against the roof. The smell of wet wood and lavender thickened the air until it was hard to breathe. Ryan stood still, fists clenched, chest rising and falling. You don't understand how things work anymore, he said, his voice trembling just enough to betray the anger beneath. Money has to move, Dad. It can't just sit there dying in an account. I'm doing the right thing. Mom's gone now. You should let me run things. That money will grow instead of rot. I waited a long moment before answering. My voice came out low, steady. If your mother were here, she'd tell you honesty never goes out of style. He gave a short, bitter laugh. You always say things like that. Like we're still living in some world that runs on morals and good intentions. The world doesn't work that way anymore. I'm doing this for us, for you too. I shook my head. No, Ryan. You're doing it for your name, not for this family. Silence again. Heavy, suffocating. Melissa's shoulders shook, once barely a sound. I heard the faint drip of water falling from Ryan's coat onto the floor, each drop a cold, deliberate beat. Finally, Ryan said, his tone hard and clipped. If you want, I'll return everything. But I'm not apologizing for trying to do what's right. I didn't speak. I just looked at him long enough for the silence to say what words couldn't. He turned first. When the door opened, the gust of wind scattered the papers on the table. Sheets of white spun through the air before falling to the floor, their sound dry and fragile, like something breaking quietly inside me. Ryan paused at the threshold, his face lit by the headlights from outside. His eyes glimmered, part fury, part shame. You're turning a small issue into a war, he said. I answered softly without looking up. You're the one who turned something sacred into property. He didn't reply. The door slammed shut. The echo lingered long after he was gone. Wind pressed against the house, carrying the cold scent of rain and lavender through the cracks. I bent down, gathering the fallen pages. One was smeared, the ink bleeding where a drop of water had touched it. The line authorized by Thomas Keaton blurred, half erased, as if it was finally confessing its own lie. I placed the sheets back on the table, smoothing them gently with my hand. Outside, I heard the engine start, tires crunching over the wet gravel. Headlights flared once across the window, then vanished into the dark. I turned toward Elaine's picture. The light caught her face, soft and alive, for an instant. I'm sorry, I whispered. I should have been stronger from the start. The thought came to me then, quiet and heavy, like a narration from somewhere beyond myself. This wasn't an argument. It was a declaration of war between a man who had already lost everything and a son who believed he could buy it all back with justification. Outside, the rain began again, soft but relentless. Drops slid down the window, merging into long, trembling lines, as if the sky itself was weeping for something that could no longer be saved. The rain hadn't stopped. It clung to the glass in slow, steady drops that traced their way downward, like thoughts that refused to fade. By the time I reached Eugene, the clouds had sunk low enough to touch the hills, and the highway shone dark as ink. 2 days had passed since the confrontation with Ryan, yet every tick of the clock in that house had sounded like a reminder of something broken. I carried the folder beside me, bank statements, photocopies of the emails, and the document I had once signed. The same sheet of paper that now stood as evidence against me. Catherine's office sat quietly on a side street, the wide windows catching what little light the morning could offer. She greeted me as she always did, but something in her eyes had changed. It was the look of someone who already knew what kind of truth was coming and wished they didn't. I placed the folder on her desk, nodded once, and said nothing. She told me she had called ahead to arrange for Sandra Cole from the Oregon Department of Justice Division of Financial Regulation. "She's thorough," Catherine said. "And she's fair." Her tone was calm, but I could hear the fatigue beneath it. I sat waiting, listening to the hum of the radiator, the faint shuffle of papers, the world narrowing down to the sound of my own breathing. On the wall hung photographs Elaine and Catherine at the opening of the scholarship fund, smiling. The sight of it felt like salt in an open wound. At exactly 11, the door opened. Sandra Cole entered with the deliberate composure of someone who'd seen too many lies dressed up as paperwork. Mid-50s firm voice, her hands large and sure as they clutched a manila envelope. She shook my hand, sat down, and spoke with the kind of certainty that leaves no room for denial. "We've reviewed the authorization form, Mr. Keaton," she said. "You didn't sign this. It's an overlay. Your signature was digitally inserted." The words landed cold. Digitally inserted. The phrase itself felt clinical, surgical. Sandra laid 2 sheets of paper side by side, one from the living trust Elaine and I had signed with Catherine, one from the file Ryan had brought me that rainy morning. She pointed with her pen. "This one's real. This one isn't. The difference is in the stop line, the hesitation at the end of the curve. Real hands tremble. Machines don't." I studied the pages, holding the breath I didn't realize I'd taken. I knew that curve. I knew the tiny pull of my hand to the right when I finished my name. The forged one had no tremor. It was too smooth, too confident, the signature of someone who'd never had to fear being caught. I felt the air leave my lungs, my voice dry and thin. "I never thought my son knew me that well," I said quietly. "Well enough to imitate the way my hand shakes." Sandra's expression didn't change. She made a few notes in her pad, her pen clicking softly. "We'll issue a notice to the bank. The accounts will be frozen for 48 hours pending investigation. But you should prepare yourself. This could escalate to a civil or criminal case depending on the response and the evidence." The words "criminal case" sat in the room like a drop of ice water spreading across the table. Catherine reached over, her hand resting briefly on mine, the warmth of it almost startling. "We'll get everything in order," she said. "I'll speak to the state investigator, and we'll make sure your name stays clean." I nodded, but my throat felt hollow. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be adrift inside a system I had always trusted to be fair. The law wasn't a shield tonight. It was a mirror showing me the price of every signature, every ounce of misplaced faith. By late afternoon, I drove back home. The sky had cleared a little, the world washed in that fragile light that comes after rain. Relief and heaviness wrestled in my chest. Relief, because the truth was finally forming. Heaviness, because my son might soon face a charge no father wants to imagine. I sat in the kitchen for a long time, watching Elaine's framed photograph reflected in the window glass. The sun was lowering behind the lake, and the light found her face just right, soft, familiar, almost alive. It looked as though she was watching something I couldn't yet see. When night fell, the phone rang. Ryan's name again. I answered this time. His voice came tight, deliberate. "Dad, why can't I access the account?" "What are you doing?" "I'm just looking for the truth," I said. "You're sabotaging me," he snapped. "You don't understand. I'm saving this family." I kept my tone calm, though my pulse betrayed me. "No," I said. "You're drowning it." Silence. A long, strained pause filled only by the faint sound of rain against the roof and the hollow drip of the gutter. then the line went dead. I set the phone down and stood there watching the screen go black, hearing my heartbeat in the quiet house. Later, I walked from room to room, touching the things Elaine left behind, the small bottle of perfume, her recipe book, with flower still pressed between the pages, a journal filled with her careful handwriting. Each object once held warmth. Tonight, they carried a new weight. Every memory now shadowed by doubt. I thought about Ryan's visits, his confidence, his easy charm, his talk about market growth and future plans. I wondered how much of what he said had ever been true. When morning came, the light was pale and clean. A new email sat at the top of my inbox. The subject line read, "Verification complete." My hand trembled as I opened it. All transfers were unauthorized. Bank has frozen the involved accounts. That was all. 2 sentences. But the finality in them filled the room. I printed the message, the paper still warm, when I placed it beside Elaine's photograph. Her smile in the frame seemed quieter today, less memory, more approval. I exhaled slowly. Outside, a gust of wind caught the curtains, making them rise and fall like the breath of the house itself. I looked out toward Mirror Lake. The surface rippled in soft circles, light catching on it like scattered coins. That silence wasn't defeat. It was preparation. The stillness before something steady begins. I stood, gathered the printed email and the copies of the statements, and walked to my study. Patience had become the only weapon left to me, and this time I intended to use it. December came with a different kind of cold that year, one that settled not just on the air, but beneath the skin, the kind that stayed. The snow had fallen early. A thin, deliberate layer spread across the wooden porch, soft as breath, but unyielding where it touched the glass. Around Mirror Lake, the pines stood motionless, their needles dusted white, bending slightly when the wind carried through. It was quiet, in a way that made the world feel suspended, as though time had stopped to listen. I spent the day preparing the dinner the way Elaine would have wanted. Nothing grand. No guests. Just the simplicity she loved, the smell of rosemary in the roast, the faint scent of lavender she always kept near the window. I moved through the kitchen slowly, each motion deliberate. When I struck the match and the fire caught, it was as if the house took its first breath in months. The living room glowed faintly under candlelight. Wax dripped down the glass holders in uneven trails, the flames bending every time the wind grazed the old windows. Elaine's photograph hung above the mantel, the frame a little tilted. Her smile was warm, but there was distance in it too, the kind that grows with time. I set 3 glasses on the table, one for me, one for her, and one for the son who still carried her last name, though not her grace. The sound of tires crunching over the frozen gravel broke the stillness. Then headlights sweeping briefly across the window. The door opened and cold air swept in, carrying the smell of gasoline and melting snow. Ryan stepped inside, brushing his sleeves, Melissa following close behind. They looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe the house had grown larger without her in it. Ryan held a small bouquet of lilies, Elaine's favorite, wrapped loosely in brown paper. He placed them on the table, his voice uncertain too, measured to be real. "Dad," he said quietly, "it's been a hard year. Maybe it's time we move on." Move on. 2 words that could mean peace or denial depending on who said them. I poured the wine, letting the sound fill the space between us. Melissa sat down first, her hands folded in her lap. "He hasn't been sleeping," she said softly. "He's trying." I set the bottle down, the glass, catching the reflection of the flames. "This table," I said, my voice steady, "is where your mother taught us about honesty. Tonight, that's all I want. The truth." Ryan shifted his eyes, flicking toward the fire. the way a boy looks toward a door he can't reach. Before he could speak, I opened the drawer and placed a yellow envelope in front of him. The seal already broken. I slid it across the table, the paper whispering against the wood. "This," I said, "is from the Department of Justice." They confirmed what we already knew. The signature was forged, the transfers frozen. For a moment, nothing moved. The clock ticked once on the wall. Ryan stared at the envelope as though it might change its contents if he looked hard enough. Then his face stiffened. The color left his knuckles where his hands clenched. "Dad," he said, barely more than a whisper. "You don't understand." I was trying to. "I understand perfectly." I didn't raise my voice. The quiet was enough. The room absorbed everything. The sound of the candles burning, the faint rustle of snow against the window. Melissa lowered her head. A single tear fell, striking the silver spoon beside her plate, catching the light before fading into nothing. Ryan looked around the room, searching for some corner of forgiveness that wasn't there. But only Elaine's eyes met his from the photograph on the wall, calm and unyielding. When I spoke again, my voice was barely above a breath. "If your mother were here, she'd ask one question. When you said you were helping this family, which part of it did you mean?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, alive, full of everything neither of us had the courage to say. Ryan stood suddenly. The chair dragged across the floor, harsh and sharp. "I don't need to sit here and listen to another moral sermon," he said, his voice shaking. "This isn't a sermon," I said, keeping my gaze steady. "It's a funeral. The second one this time for trust." His face flushed. He grabbed his coat, eyes hard and bright like ice. Melissa reached for his arm, but he pulled away. Without another word, he turned and walked out. The door slammed, and the flame nearest to it trembled violently before steadying again. I stayed seated, my hand resting on the table. The room still glowed with warmth, but it no longer felt alive. The air seemed heavier, as if grief itself had learned how to breathe. 3 glasses of wine sat between the plates. Elaine's shimmered softly in the light. Ryan's remained untouched. I lifted mine and looked into it. The color was deep, the kind that reminded you of old blood. It burned down my throat, bitter and final. Melissa was still there. Her voice came small, almost childlike. "He didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said. "He just wanted to prove he could do something right." I turned toward her. Sometimes I said people destroy what they love most just to prove they were strong enough to handle it. She nodded, her face wet, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry, Mr. Keaton," she said. I looked at her kindly. "Be careful, Melissa. The truth doesn't punish, it waits. Some meet it early, some meet it late." She left soon after. I heard the car start, saw the light sweep once across the window, then vanish into the dark. And then there was only me, and the candles, and the quiet. I reached for the envelope. Inside the paper bore the seal of the Department of Justice, the words "unauthorized" printed in heavy black ink. I read them again and again, until they blurred, until I could almost imagine Elaine's voice speaking them, soft, sorrowful, but resolute. I looked up at her picture. The candlelight danced across her face, making her look alive again, almost real. I could hear her as clearly as the night she told Ryan that truth, no matter how painful, was still the gentler road. No shouting, no breaking glass. Just silence. The kind that lets you hear the echo of something falling apart. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying sleet across the lake in slow, silver arcs. The last candle trembled once, then straightened its flame, leaning toward the dark, like it was listening. The room cooled, the lavender scent fading into air, that no longer remembered warmth. And for the first time since Elaine died, I realized the world hadn't gone quiet. It was only waiting for what came next. 2 weeks later, my son's name appeared on the front page of the Bend Chronicle. The headline stretched across half the paper, bold and merciless, like a blade cutting through the last thin layer of quiet I'd been holding on to. Keaton Financial Group under state investigation for misuse of memorial trust funds. Beneath the headline was a photo of Ryan, head bowed, shoulders hunched, stepping out of an office building through a crowd of reporters. The rain blurred the image, softening its edges, but not enough to hide the bewilderment on his face. I sat by the window, the newspaper unfolded across the dining table. The house was so still I could hear the wind brushing against the wooden siding. Outside Mirror Lake lay under a veil of mist, reflecting a sky the color of worn silver. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel satisfaction. Only the kind of emptiness that comes when something is taken from you, not suddenly, but piece by piece until you no longer recognize what's missing. The phone rang all morning. Neighbors, reporters, Helen Brooks. Elaine's old friend called, her voice trembling. "Tom, I just read the paper. Are you all right?" I looked at the photo again before answering. "I didn't lose anything, Helen," I said quietly. "I only took back what already belonged to Elaine." There was a pause, then the sound of her breathing, soft and uncertain, before she hung up. By noon, a weak band of sunlight slipped through the curtain. The light fell on the kitchen table where the paper still lay open. The phone rang again. This time it was Sandra Cole. Her tone was calm, but I could hear the fatigue of someone who'd spent too long handling other people's wreckage. "We've concluded the investigation," she said. "The bank has frozen all corporate accounts. Ryan will lose his financial license." She hesitated, then added, "Do you want to press criminal charges?" I walked to the window. The lake was still smooth as glass, reflecting the dull winter sky. I could see my reflection in it, older, steadier, and more distant than I remembered. "No," I said. "I don't need my son in prison. I just want him to look in the mirror one day and not recognize the man staring back." There was silence on the other end, then Sandra spoke softly. "Sometimes justice isn't punishment, Mr. Keaton. It's the moment someone finally faces themselves." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. That afternoon, the snow came back, sparse, quiet, deliberate. When I stepped outside to get the mail, a small envelope sat alone in the box. No return address. I tore it open carefully. Inside was a check for $25,000 signed by Melissa. Folded with it, a short handwritten note. "I'm sorry, Mr. Keaton. I knew, and I stayed silent. Please forgive me." The paper smelled faintly of perfume, the same scent Elaine used to wear on Sundays. I stood there a long time, staring at the handwriting, the uneven pressure of the pen. I didn't feel anger or pity. Only a kind of exhaustion that sank deep into the lungs, the kind you don't cough out. I didn't cash the check. I folded it neatly and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk, the one that held Elaine's photograph. The picture of her in the lavender garden hair, loose in the wind, that small knowing smile. I slid the check beneath the frame and closed the drawer gently. Evening came early, as it does in Oregon winters. I lit the fire. The crackle of wood filled the room, the smell of pine resin rising like incense. The flame cast long shadows up the wall, merging with Elaine's photograph above the mantel, until her face seemed to move, not quite alive, not quite gone. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat back, and listened to the fire. And then softly in my head came the voice I've come to know too well, my own low, and even as if narrating a story too old to stop telling. When a house collapses, no one blames the storm. They only realize the foundation had been rotting for years. Later that night, I drove into Bend. The streets were thinly dusted with snow, and the restaurants along the main road glowed in warm light. When I reached the corner where Keaton Financial Group once stood, I slowed the car. The building was dark, the glass doors boarded over. The company sign, once polished proud, had been removed, leaving 4 round holes in the metal frame like empty eyes. I parked across the street and stepped out. The cold hit immediately sharp, almost cleansing. Through the glass I could see the empty office. Desks gone, floors bare. A few scraps of paper skittered across the floor where the wind slipped through the doorframe. The reflection of the streetlight lay across the window, and in that dim glass I saw my own face. An old man, tired. But this time the eyes didn't flinch. And in that reflection, for a fleeting second, I saw another image layered over mine, Ryan at 12 riding the bicycle I'd fixed for him, high-fiving as he circled the yard, calling for his mother to look. The soundless memory lingered in the glass, then dissolved back into the man I'd become. I drove home slowly, the snow sweeping across the headlights like drifting ash. Streetlights turned the windshield gold in passing, each glow fading before the next began. And I realized the ruin between us hadn't started with money or power. It had started years ago in the spaces between dinners I missed, in the nights Elaine sat alone by this same lake waiting for me to come home. By the time I reached Mirror Lake, the surface had begun to freeze. The air was still. The moon hung low, pale and perfect, reflected in the ice. I stood on the porch for a long while, the cold biting at my fingers, and looked out at the water. The reflection staring back at me wasn't one of guilt or victory, just quiet acceptance. That night, for the first time in months, I slept. No dreams, no echoes, only the soft rhythm of the wind moving through the trees like a voice I hadn't heard in a long time, whispering that somehow everything had finally found its place again. February 2025. The morning in Bend was washed in a pale gray light, the kind that made everything look half awake, suspended somewhere between winter and spring. I was pouring coffee when the phone rang. The sound echoed through the empty house, slow and deliberate, as if testing whether I was still there to answer. Catherine Doyle's voice came through the line, steady but touched with something fragile. "Thomas," she said, "I found something in Elaine's old files. A letter. Handwritten. I think she meant for you to have it, when the time came." For a moment I couldn't speak. The smell of coffee drifted up between us, or maybe it was just habit trying to anchor me in the present. Finally, I said, "I'll come." By afternoon, I was driving south to Eugene. The familiar road traced its curve along the foothills, flanked by slopes, where the snow had begun to melt into thin silver streams. Weak sunlight broke through the clouds now and then, flashing against the windshield like quiet signals. Elaine used to sit in that passenger seat, map unfolded across her lap, humming as she pointed out the right turn whenever I took the wrong one. Now the seat beside me was empty, cold to the touch. Catherine's office was exactly as I remembered: warm lamplight, the faint smell of paper and pine wood, and the clock on the far wall ticking with the patience of someone who had learned to wait. She rose when I entered, holding a cream-colored envelope in both hands. The paper was yellowed at the edges, soft from age. On the front, written in the tilt I knew better than my own, were the words, "For Tom, when you start doubting." I took it carefully. My palms felt cold even against the paper's warmth. Catherine's voice dropped to a whisper. "I think she wanted you to have it when you were ready." I nodded, thanked her, and sat down by the window. The envelope opened with a soft tear. The faint scent of old ink escaped, the kind of smell that belongs to a room where someone used to write letters beside a half-finished cup of tea. The window cracked open, just enough for the wind to listen. Inside was a single folded page. Elaine's handwriting, delicate, deliberate trembling slightly near the edges. "My love," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I've already gone. Don't let anger or fear consume you. Believe in the truth, not in what you wish were true. If our child ever goes astray, don't seek revenge. Let time teach him. Justice finds its way even when we no longer can. I believe light always knows how to come home even when no one is left to guide it." I read slowly, tracing every letter as if touching her voice. The ink had faded in places, but the rhythm of her handwriting still carried her breath. I read it again, then once more. Each time the silence around me deepened, as though the world itself had leaned in to listen. When I finally folded the letter, my hands were trembling. Outside the window, snow was melting from the roof across the street, dripping into a steady rhythm on the pavement below. The afternoon light glanced off the desk, and for a moment the folded letter glowed like a small mirror. Catherine said nothing. She didn't need to. There are moments when silence is the only respectful language left. I slipped the letter into my coat pocket and stood. Before leaving, I looked around the office, the place where Elaine once sat beside Catherine, signing papers, discussing what would remain when she no longer could. It struck me then what she had left behind wasn't wealth, but peace. The rain began halfway home, light and cold, falling in long threads that shimmered against the windshield. Mirror Lake appeared through the trees, its surface glazed with silver light. I pulled over, engine idling, and stared at the water. Mist rose from it like smoke curling into the low sky. I opened the window. The air smelled of wet wood, of lavender long since gone from the porch, but somehow still lingering. When I reached home, I brewed the tea she loved, orange peel and honey. The steam carried its sweetness through the quiet room. I sat by the window, the letter open again, reading in the dim amber glow of the late afternoon. Each line felt like a conversation that we'd paused years ago and were just now returning to. I remembered her last weeks, her voice faint but steady, her eyes still bright. She had said, "Don't be afraid of losing direction. Just look toward where the light falls. It always finds its way back." Back then I hadn't understood. Now I did. She hadn't been speaking about heaven. She'd been speaking about us. I folded the letter once more carefully, as though rough hands might break something sacred. Then I went to the cabinet, found an old glass frame, and placed the letter inside. I set it beside our wedding photo on the wooden shelf, the one that always caught the last light of day. The room grew still. Not the stillness of absence, but of return. The kind that feels like someone just entered quietly, took a seat, and decided to stay a while. I looked at her photograph. The sun caught the glass just right, and for an instant her smile seemed to move, faint but alive. I reached out my fingers, brushing the frame. No anger, no bitterness. Only gratitude that even in loss she had left me something greater than comfort. A map, a compass, a truth that no longer needed proof, that even the slowest kind of light still knows its way home. Outside, the wind stirred the curtains. The last of the sunlight fell across the framed letter, a thin golden line sliding over her words. I sat there listening to the wind, the clock, the faint breath of time itself, as if a door had quietly opened somewhere between past and present, and for a moment everything met again. Quietly, completely. Early autumn in Oregon brought back warmth like a quiet apology after a long silence. The lavender on the porch had bloomed again, soft violet, calm and fragrant. The way it was that first summer Elaine planted them. The breeze from Mirror Lake carried the scent across the water, threading through the pines, drifting over the open fields, and following the narrow road that led toward downtown Bend. I stood on the porch for a while, watching the color spread across the damp soil, then decided it was time. That morning I drove to Bend High School, the place Elaine had taught for over 20 years. The sky was clear, brushed with a few wandering clouds. The red brick buildings looked unchanged, sunlight spilling across the courtyard, where students' laughter echoed bright and alive like a season beginning again. Mary Grant, the principal, met me at the door. Her silver hair caught the light, her smile gentle, touched with the sadness of someone who'd said too many goodbyes. "Elaine was the soul of this school," she said softly. "We never forgot her." I nodded, then unfolded a single sheet of paper I'd kept in my jacket pocket and placed it on the oak desk between us. "The Elaine Keaton Memorial Scholarship Fund," I said, "for students who've struggled but stayed honest." Mary scanned the document, eyes glistening a little, before she reached out and squeezed my shoulder. "She'd be proud, Tom. So proud." The ceremony was small, just the way Elaine would have wanted. It was held in the old library, her favorite room, the one where she'd tutored students after hours. The air smelled of dust and pine and the faint trace of chalk. No decorations. No speeches. Only a few rows of chairs, a table at the front, and sunlight falling in through the blinds like threads of memory. There were teachers, a handful of students, Catherine Doyle, Helen Brooks, and even Rachel Monroe, the young journalist from the Bend Chronicle. I stepped to the table, adjusted the microphone. It was too low, almost unnecessary, and spoke without notes. "Elaine believed justice didn't live only in courtrooms," I said. "She believed it also lived in the ways we help each other stand up again. She taught that every small act of decency was its own kind of fairness." I stopped for a moment. The air was still. Some heads were bowed. Others met my eyes with quiet tears. Then I opened the first envelope, the inaugural scholarship check, and read the name aloud. Lucia Ramirez. A small girl in the front row stood nervous and wide-eyed. Her black hair was tied back neatly. I knew her face. She was the daughter of a maintenance worker who lived near the lake. Elaine had taught her to read when she was only 7. Lucia approached slowly, both hands trembling as I handed her the envelope. Her eyes filled, and when I leaned closer, I spoke softly, "Just for her, heap your promise to your mother. Study hard, but don't ever forget to be kind." She nodded, tears streaking down her cheeks. I rested a hand on her shoulder before stepping back. The room filled with applause, modest, heartfelt enough to bridge the space between grief and grace. Through the tall library windows, sunlight caught the dust in the air, turning it gold. It was the same light I remembered from the day I first met Elaine, her standing at the chalkboard, smiling, as her students argued about a poem, her eyes lit with that same early spring brightness. I was about to leave when movement by the doorway stopped me. Ryan stood there. A white shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. No tie. His hair shorter now, his frame thinner. He didn't step inside. He only stood at the threshold, hands in his pockets, sunlight breaking across his face in fractured lines. Our eyes met. No words. No gestures. Just a long, still look across the space of a year, across everything that had been broken and everything that could not be taken back. In his face, I saw the exhaustion of someone who'd finally stopped running. And something else, regret, unspoken but heavy. I gave a small nod. Not forgiveness, not even reconciliation. Just recognition. The kind Elaine would have understood. Ryan lowered his head slightly, then turned and walked away. The door eased shut behind him. I stayed where I was, listening to the faint wind move through the hallway, carrying the scent of lavender from the schoolyard. Mary came to stand beside me. She touched my arm. "You've done what she always hoped you would." I smiled, a small, tired smile, but felt something inside me finally lighten. By the time everyone had left, the afternoon sun slanted low across the room. The scholarship folders sat neatly on the table, the microphone tilted to one side. The golden light spilled over the small brass plaque on the wall, Elaine Keaton Memorial Scholarship. I took a deep breath. Outside, I could hear students laughing again, the sound bright and young rolling in through the open window. Life moving forward exactly as she'd wanted. As I stepped out of the building, I turned once more. The library door was still open. The curtain by the window fluttered lightly in the breeze, and for just a second I could almost see her standing there, again smiling, chalk in hand, surrounded by sunlight and the sound of pages turning. That evening, the lake caught the sunset. The water glowed in streaks of amber and violet, still as glass. I pulled over on the roadside, lowered the window, and let the wind in. In my head, the thought came softly, like a voice I didn't have to name. People say justice is punishment, but sometimes it's simply a chance to begin again with kindness. I looked toward the lake where the light rippled across its surface, and in that moment I believed that the light had at last found its way home. October 2025. Mirror Lake lay still as glass, the morning wrapped in a thin silver mist that looked close enough to touch. The air was crisp, clean, the kind that holds its breath before autumn breaks fully into color. I could smell pine in the wind and lavender from the porch, mixing gently with the scent of freshly brewed coffee. I stood where Elaine used to sit and read her wooden chair, still bearing the small crack on the armrest, the same soft plaid blanket folded neatly across its back. The world was quiet in a way that wasn't empty, only paused. On the table beside me sat the small wooden box I opened every morning, as if it were part of a ritual. Inside each item carried the pulse of her absence, the letter she wrote before she died, our wedding photo taken in the lavender garden in 1985, and the first scholarship receipt from the fund that bore her name. At the bottom lay the check, $25,000, the one Melissa had sent a year ago. The paper was worn now, its corners creased, but the apology written across it was still clear, still small and trembling, like someone who knew exactly what forgiveness cost. I folded it again carefully and placed it where it belonged. Then I poured another cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching light push through the mist. The rays caught on the surface of the lake, long and trembling, like cracks in memory. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Ryan's name lit the screen. His voice came through hoarse, quieter than I remembered. Dad. I read Mom's letter. I said nothing, just listened to his breathing, uneven, weighted with something too heavy to name. I'm sorry, he said. No defense followed, just quiet, the kind that hums between two people who finally ran out of excuses. Then after a while he added, I'd like to see you. Not to explain, just to talk. I took a slow breath. The door's not locked, I said. You know that. That afternoon, Oregon turned gold. The light soaked into everything, the trees, the porch, even the air itself. I heard his car pull up outside, the engine cutting off. When I stepped out, he was already standing among the rows of lavender hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the lake. He looked thinner, older. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from learning too late what truly matters. I sold the rest of my shares, he said, still staring ahead. Paid back everyone I owed. No one made you do that, I said. I know, he answered softly. But I didn't want Mom to be ashamed of me again. We sat together on the old wooden steps of the porch. The boards were worn smooth. I'd repaired them myself last year, while Elaine sat beside me laughing, that the scent of pine always made her feel like a child again. Now it was just me and the sun, who had once broken something inside me so deeply I wasn't sure it could mend. Between us there was space, a thin invisible distance made of all that hadn't been said, all that hadn't yet been forgiven. After a while I spoke. Your mother used to say there are two kinds of people in the world. Those who spend their lives trying to win, and those who spend it trying to do what's right. You can still choose which kind you'll be. Ryan turned toward me, eyes red but steady. I want to do what's right this time, he said quietly. I looked at him for a long while. If he'd said those words a year ago, I might not have believed him. But now in his face I saw no defense, only the tired humility of a man who had lost enough to understand what it means to start again. The wind rose over the lake, soft but certain, rippling the water. The scent of lavender drifted past us, and I remembered Elaine saying once that lavender doesn't fear the wind. It needs it to spread its scent farther. Maybe wounds are like that too. Given time, even pain learns to turn into something gentler. Ryan's voice was low when he spoke again. Dad, I know I can't erase what I did, but I want to rebuild in a way Mom would be proud of. No one expects you to be perfect, I said. Just honest. You can lose, but don't ever lie. He nodded, his hands tightening together. We sat there until the sun began to fall behind the trees. The lake divided itself into two colors, one side burning gold, the other slipping into violet shadow. I looked at the reflection trembling across the surface and thought forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's being able to look at a wound and no longer wish to strike back. Ryan stood straightening his shirt, glancing around as though trying to memorize the place. I'll help you with the scholarship fund, he said softly. Mom would want that. I nodded once. She would. That was all we needed. He turned toward the path that led through the trees, the sunset folding him slowly into its light. I watched until his figure disappeared, not with anger, not with sorrow, but with a quiet I hadn't known in years. Dusk settled in. Mist rose again from the lake, thin and white like breath. The house stood still, the air carrying only the scent of wet grass and pine. And for the first time I felt no weight in my chest. Not because everything was over, but because I'd learned that endings aren't losses. They're just things we've finally set down. Inside, I switched on the kitchen light. The coffee on the table had long gone cold. The soft glow touched the frame on the wall. Our wedding photo. Elaine's smile caught forever in the early light of another life. I looked at her face and thought somehow she was still here watching us learn slowly, painfully, how to live again. I sat at the table, opened the old notebook, and began to write. Next year, the scholarship will expand by 2 more students, priority to engineering majors. I paused, smiled faintly, and listened to the sound of the wind outside moving through the lavender. If this story made you think about forgiveness, legacy, or the quiet kind of justice that changes us, leave a comment, share it with someone who might need peace tonight. Because sometimes justice doesn't come with noise. It comes with silence.